Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Office 365 Dev Pulse. My name is Scot Hillier. I'm your host. And today, this is going to be all me. No guests today. I'm going to be covering the topic myself. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be building a SharePoint-hosted add-in using Angular 2 and TypeScript. So before we get started, just a few thoughts on that. One of the reasons that I wanted to do a SharePoint hosted add-in instead of maybe going for a provider hosted add-in or something more sophisticated is that I purposely wanted to eliminate a lot of the authentication authorization from the equation so that we could just focus on the actual use of TypeScript and Angular 2 inside the code. And I think that will help you understand some of the basic concepts of Angular 2 and TypeScript together and how we as SharePoint developers can take advantage of those technologies. And then we'll go on further in later shows and later articles that I do to add in some of the authentication and authorization stuff. Before we get started on any of the technical stuff, I just want to make sure that we thank Microsoft, our sponsor, for sponsoring the show. Without them, we wouldn't be here. So as always, big shout out to Microsoft. Okay, so a couple other things before we get rolling here. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can see a few things I've got. All right, good. So for some reason, Skype for Business is still starting up. That's fun. That'll undoubtedly come up right in the middle of everything we're doing and start throwing some notifications. But what we're going to look at here is some web pages. So first of all, what I'm doing for you is loosely based here on an article that I wrote on IT Unity, build a SharePoint add-in with Angular 2 and TypeScript. So you can check that out after we're done. And also you can get the source code for today's session on the IT Unity GitHub repository, which is github.com/IT Unity, where you'll find a dev branch and inside of there a SharePoint hosted folder there with the source code from today. So check those out when we're done with the presentation. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do is build, as I said, a simple add-in so we can concentrate on the pieces parts. And so let's go ahead and start up Visual Studio 2015. One of the things that you're going to want to do in order to be successful building these is to make sure that you have all the latest and greatest updates for Visual Studio. So go out and make sure you get the latest version of ASP.NET 5. Make sure you get the latest version of TypeScript, and that all those are available to you when you get started. Then things will work for you pretty much the same way that you'll see me do them. Okay, so here we are inside of Visual Studio. I'm going to go ahead and just start a new project as we would expect. I'm going to come up and say File, New Project, and we're going to go ahead and create a new SharePoint add-in. So I'll come into SharePoint Apps. I'll pick App for SharePoint. We can put that pretty much anywhere we want. This looks fine. Let's go ahead and click OK. And as expected, it's going to walk me through the wizard here. It's asking me for a site where I would like to debug my SharePoint add-in, and I'm going to pick a site that I have in Office 365. You could do this in a SharePoint on-premises environment as well, but we're going to use an Office 365 environment, so I'm pointing to one, and go ahead and click Next. And when I do, it's going to prompt me to sign into that environment. Give it a second here. There we go. Go ahead and enter credentials. And we're selecting SharePoint Online and finish. Okay, we'll give it a second here to finish building up our starting project. It's coming. Whenever you're doing presentations, it always seems like the computer runs slower, doesn't it? Come on. All right. There we go. Okay, so now we've got the basic starting SharePoint add-in that we've seen many times. So what we need to do though is this add-in, this template that we have, obviously it's not built for Angular 2 and TypeScript. So we're going to need to clean it up a little bit in order to use it the way we want. So I'm just going to come in here and clean up the default page. We're going to go ahead and just get rid of some comments here, and I'll come into the placeholder additional page head, and let's just go ahead and get rid of the script references that are in here by default because we won't need them. Clean that up, get rid of these comments, just remove as much confusion as possible. Go ahead and get rid of that. All right, clean that up, and we can give this a little title here if we want. My first Angular 2 add-in, like that. Okay, so we've got this pretty simple now, all cleaned up. What we're going to do now is let's go ahead and add in the Cdn references that we're going to need for our application. So even though we're using TypeScript, obviously under the covers, this is ultimately a JavaScript application. So we're going to need some references to JavaScript libraries for this to work. So I'm going to go ahead and grab some pre-canned stuff I've got here and drop it in. And let's go ahead and take a look at what I've added here. So I've gone ahead and added in some script references. Let's take a look at each one. You can see that I have the first one here is this ES6 shim. Basically what you've got here when you're trying to build Angular 2 applications is you're really trying to leverage the most modern capabilities that JavaScript has to offer. What you hear called ECMAScript 6 or 7, or sometimes ECMAScript 2015. So we're looking for capabilities that are really very forward-looking in JavaScript, but not all of the browsers are going to be able to support these capabilities. So when you're writing Angular 2 applications, you need some shims and polyfills to make sure that the functionality you'd like to use from ECMAScript 6 is going to work cross-browser. So you can see we've got this ECMAScript 6 shim. We also have a system polyfill and an Angular 2 polyfill, all of which are designed to support functionality cross-browser where that functionality, that ECMAScript 6 functionality, may not exist yet. The next library that you see there is system.js. This is a very important library, and this goes to the concept of enterprise module loading. If you're not familiar with the concept of using modules in JavaScript, it's something that you need to really put on your list of things to look into. Taking a little bit of a step back to talk about modules, when you first learn JavaScript, basically, what everybody learns is writing a bunch of functions, and everyone writes a bunch of functions inside of a library, and that's their JavaScript. As you move further into JavaScript, you begin to understand that when you write code that way, what you're really doing is attaching those functions to the window object. So you've taken a whole bunch of functions and made them members of the window object. And then if somebody else does that same thing, the code that you write can collide with the code that other people write. So in order to get to the next step in your JavaScript development, what you learn to do is you learn to compartmentalize your JavaScript into what we call modules. Modules are a way to contain your JavaScript so that it doesn't interfere with other people's JavaScript and so that it doesn't pollute the global namespace. That works great for your own stuff, but then as you begin to take that even further into enterprise JavaScript application, we find that when we write enterprise JavaScript applications, what we want to do is not only have our code modularized, but we would like to load those modules on demand. So, as you learn modules, what you often find is that when you're writing a JavaScript application, you have about 10,000 script references in your home page, and those are all pointing to various libraries. But why would you want to load all of those right away when the application first starts, right? So the idea is to be able to load your modules dynamically as you need them. Now, as that idea has taken hold inside the JavaScript community, there have been some, we'll call them competing methods for loading modules. And different communities have used different ones. Node has used a different approach than client-side script has used. And there's an effort in place now to try and unify that module loading so that it becomes standardized across all browsers going forward. And the way that standard is going to look is it's going to load using the system pattern. And so what I've got here is this library system.js, which is going to allow me to load my modules in a way that ultimately will become the standard. So that's why I'm using system.js. And you can also see down here at the bottom where I've got system config, I have some configuration information about how I want the system to load modules. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The next one is rx.js. Rx are the reactive extensions. And what reactive extensions allow you to do, we're going to see those used mostly when we begin to build our own services. If you've been in JavaScript a while, you've probably used promises. And promises are great because they allow you to make asynchronous calls and then receive information when that asynchronous call is complete. Well, reactive extensions are like promises, only better. So we get a bunch of additional capabilities that overcome some of the limitations of promises. But if you've used promises in the past, you can simply think of the reactive extensions library as adding in that capability for us to use promise-like functionality with Angular 2. And so you can say I have all those supporting libraries that are in place. And then finally, the very last library I'm loading is the Angular 2 library. So a bunch of supporting libraries come into play, and then finally that core Angular 2. And then, as I said, the very last thing I'm doing is configuring the system loader. I'm telling it where it can find the JavaScripts for the application. So it's going to expect to find my code in a folder called scripts, and it's going to expect that they will have an extension of JS and that they'll have the format, the register format. Now that register format is that standardized module format. So when I create a module, it's going to expect it to take a certain form so that it knows how to load it dynamically. Ultimately, we haven't made it yet, but ultimately we're going to start our application with a module called boot. And you'll see me make that in a little bit here. So that should set us up for everything that we need to get the framework in play inside of our SharePoint-hosted add-in. Okay. Let's see, what else do we want to do? Next, what we're going to do is come down to the body here, the placeholder main, and I'm going to go ahead and drop in another snippet that I've already got ready to roll here, a new placeholder main. And inside here, let's do this. I want to keep that and just go ahead and, oops, one more time. Let's just get rid of the redundant stuff here. Just want to get rid of the extra here since I copied the whole snippet. Good. All we're really looking to do is to add this one tag here, app-main. We're going to see this a little bit later in the code, but basically everything I do in my Angular application is going to be fed into this one placeholder right here, app-main. Angular 2, just like its predecessor, Angular 1.x, is a single page application framework. So we're going to have a single page application in our SharePoint-hosted add-in. My single page is going to be this default.aspx, and everything I generate dynamically is going to go into this app-main tag. I could have called it anything I want. I'm calling it app-main, and we'll see that come into play in just a little bit when we start writing code. Okay, other things you have to do here. Let's go ahead and save this. Now, remember this template that we got, this is the old school template, and if you come over here, of course, it contains a reference to jQuery, right? So, you know, this is the old template that we would use for making add-ins that originally was based on the idea of using jQuery. Well, we're not using jQuery in our Angular 2 application. We're using Angular 2. So we want to go ahead and clean up some of these things. So I'm going to get rid of that jQuery reference. And the right way to get rid of it here in the SharePoint-hosted add-in is to right-click your project and click Manage NuGet Packages. and then we can see the NuGet package here that was installed, the jQuery, and we're just going to simply click uninstall to get rid of it. Great, and that will make jQuery go away. So you can see my project is getting cleaner over there on the right. And then we also get this app.js. This is what Microsoft gives us for free when we get started with our add-in. And this app.js contains a bunch of client-side object model code. We're also not going to be using this in our application, so we can go ahead and just take this app.js and delete it. Get rid of that. Okay. And so now we've got ourselves a pretty clean project here that really consists of very little more than this default.aspx page and the framework necessary to load this thing up as a SharePoint hosted add-in. The next thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm now going to start to structure this thing so that we can use it with Angular 2. And the way that I want to do that is by adding a new folder into the root of my project, and I'm going to call this the app folder. Now, my basic strategy here, and you're going to see this come to life as we move ahead, is that I'm going to write my TypeScript files inside of this folder called app. But I have no intention of deploying those TypeScript folders to SharePoint. TypeScript itself, if you haven't played with it, is really a superset of JavaScript that brings a lot of real value to us, not only in terms of typing variables for us and preventing common mistakes, but when you write with TypeScript, you get cross-browser support, so you don't have to really worry about what browsers you're targeting. You can kind of write your code in the same way, and TypeScript will take care of the cross-browser support. You also get the module loading capabilities built into it. So what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to write code that feels a lot more like you're writing classes and objects, and then under the covers, TypeScript is going to take care of all the dynamic module loading stuff. But all of that is really the developer experience, right? I want to work with TypeScript files, but I'm not going to deploy my TypeScript files to SharePoint. Ultimately, those TypeScript files get compiled into JavaScript files, and it's the JavaScript files that I need to go up into SharePoint. So the app folder here in the root of my project is going to be my working folder for TypeScript. But ultimately, what I need to do is I need to get my JavaScript files into this scripts module, this scripts node in the project, and anything in the scripts node in the project is going to go up into SharePoint. So that's why we have the app folder, to try to separate those two things. Now, one of the great things about Visual Studio 2015 is that we've got TypeScript support built into Visual Studio 2015, and we've got it built in a number of different ways. You can create a project in Visual Studio 2015 that is purely TypeScript support. So the idea is just make an HTML and TypeScript file, TypeScript project. You can write HTML and TypeScript to your heart's content and make a website that way. So there's a whole project just for that. But you can also take projects that you're working on, templates that you're already using, like this SharePoint-hosted add-in, and simply add TypeScript support to it. And that's what we need to do. So we also have a number of different ways that we can add TypeScript support to what we're doing. And as I was figuring out how to make a SharePoint add-in using TypeScript and Angular 2, I kind of worked through all the different ways to do that and arrived what I think is the best way to make this work repeatedly. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to come to the root of our project, and we're going to add a new file. So we'll say add a new item. And what we want to add is a JSON file. So I'll come up here to the add, and I'll simply type JSON for JSON. So it'll go looking, and you can see all the different JSON files I have. Now, the file that we're looking, pardon me, the file that we're looking to create is known as a TypeScript configuration file. And it tells the TypeScript compiler how to behave inside of your application. If you had made in Visual Studio 2015 an HTML and TypeScript project from a different template, you could come into the add items and you would find the TypeScript configuration file as a template that you can add to your project. Now, for whatever reason, when we're making the SharePoint hosted add-in here, we don't have this file available. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to make the file by picking a regular old generic JSON file, and then I'm just going to rename it. So we're going to name it tsconfig for TypeScript config, and that is a name that is expected. So when Visual Studio sees TypeScript config, it understands what it is that you're trying to tell it. So we're going to go ahead and add that. And of course, I'm basically going to get a blank file here. Here's my tsconfig, nothing special in it right now. And what we'll do then is I'll delete all this, and I'm going to go ahead and drag in some contents that I already have ready and drop them. And let's take a look at what we've got here. So when you have a JSON file, it's a file that you expect to create in JSON format. So you can see my curly braces and my commas and my colons that make up a JSON object. And then you'll see that the tsconfig has this set of compiler options. And the compiler options are telling the TypeScript compiler how to behave. So for example, you can see that I'm asking it to compile to ECMAScript 5. So right away, you can see one of the big values of TypeScript is that I can target a particular language here. So I'm targeting ECMAScript 5, even though I'm going to write and use constructs that might be found in ECMAScript 6. It's going to all end up being ECMAScript 5 ultimately when it compiles. And so therefore, I have a good guarantee that the browsers that hit it are going to be able to run my application. Another key thing to point out here is the module. So I have indicated to TypeScript that I'm going to be using system modules. Remember, there are a couple of different approaches that you can use for module format. But we're going to be using the system module format, which goes hand in hand with our choice to use the system module loader as our library that we referenced in default.aspx. Another key thing I want to point out is the output directory. So the output directory is looking for the scripts directory here. And what this is telling the TypeScript compiler is it's telling it that when you compile it, I want the JavaScript to go in a different directory than the TypeScript is in. So I want that to go in the scripts directory. And you'll notice right away that that's going to fulfill my strategy here, because I'll be able to put my TypeScript files in the app folder, but the JavaScript files will get compiled into the scripts folder. So that's the key trick there in being able to separate out the TypeScript files from the JavaScript files and get those JavaScript files in the correct place for the SharePoint hosted add-in template to be able to use them and get them deployed online. Okay, so now we've got our TypeScript compilation configured. We'll go ahead and save that. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to add in support for all the different libraries I want to use in conjunction with my TypeScript. Now, remember that when we're using TypeScript, what we're doing is we're creating at a level of abstraction, right? So we're not really writing the JavaScript, we're at a higher level of abstraction, and I will compile to JavaScript. But when I'm at that higher level of abstraction, I still want to have access to the capabilities of other JavaScript libraries. So I need to load the pieces of those other JavaScript libraries that understand TypeScript and can also work with me. So we're going to be loading in packages that contain not only the JavaScript from the various libraries we care about, but something called the TypeScript Taipings. TypeScript Taipings are the pieces that TypeScript needs in order to recognize the objects from other libraries and for those objects to work with the TypeScript that you're writing. And ultimately, it's also going to give us IntelliSense as well. Now, in Visual Studio, there are a couple of ways to be able to load these typings. And like I said, as I worked my way through the various ways to use TypeScript and to get these libraries in place, I landed on what I think is the best way to do it. So I'm going to share that with you now. Basically, all of the stuff that you need for Angular 2 is available to you through the Node Package Manager, NPM. if you're not familiar with the Node Package Manager, it's kind of like a NuGet, or some of you might use Bower or what have you, but it's basically a way to get the third-party libraries and TypeScript support, et cetera, that you need. And it's now in Visual Studio 2015. So we have a couple of different ways that we can do it. Again, I think I've hit on what is the best and most repeatable way in this situation. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the Start menu. And what we're going to do is we're going to run the Node.js command prompt. Let's go ahead and run that as an administrator. Say yes. Okay. So the Node.js command prompt is going to give me access to the Node packages that I need to download. And so what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and change the directory here to the directory where our project is located. So if I come in here to where we're currently working on our project, we can drill in a little bit. There's my SharePoint app 1 right there. Okay. So this is the root of my project that I'm working on. I'm going to go ahead and grab that file path, and I'm going to come back to my Node console here, and we're going to do a change directory and paste in that file path. Great. And then just change to the D drive like that. Okay, so now I've got Node pointed at that location. So now what I can do from here is invoke the Node Package Manager, and I simply do that by saying npm, and then I can say I'd like to install some Node packages, and then I can name the packages that I need. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to install the packages that are related to the libraries that we set references to in the beginning. So if you try and keep all these moving pieces in mind, ultimately, as I said, we're really deploying a JavaScript application. But since I'm writing in TypeScript, I want to pull down a lot of things that are going to help me write in TypeScript. I have no intention of deploying any of these goodies up into SharePoint. They're all going to help me during the development process. So what types of things do I want? Well, we want Angular 2. So I'm going to ask for Angular 2. I'm going to ask for System.js, so we can do our system module loading. We can ask for ES6 shim support, like the ES6 promise, or the ES6 shim itself, like that. And last but not least, how about the reactive extensions, which can be found in RxJS. Now, so there's a little bit of secret decoder ring stuff here with just knowing what the names of these packages are. But you can go up to the Node Package Manager site and you can do searching. And frankly, after you get through this a couple of times, the ones that you really care about become second nature. So we're going to go ahead and just go ahead and hit enter here. And then what should happen is this thing will go up to the Node Package Manager, and it will find all the packages we want, much like NuGet does. And it's going to pull them down and make them part of my project, dropping them into the directory that I just specified so they can become part of our project. Let's give it a second to finish that up. Working on it. There we go. All right, looks good. So let's see what we got. If I come back now to the folder where my project is, you'll notice that there is now a new folder in here called Node_modules. When you get packages from the Node Package Manager, they're always going to get dropped into a folder called Node_modules. So if you double click on this, you can see all the different packages that I got downloaded here. So I got all the ones I asked for, plus I would have gotten any dependencies that had to come down as well. And so now all of these packages are now part of my project. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that if we come back to our project here and we look in the solution folder, of course, in the Solution Explorer over there, I don't see Node_modules. I could see it if I come up here and I click on the Show All Files button. There it is. You can see Node_modules is hidden from us. Now, as I was working through all the different variations of this, I tried many times to sort of bring this into the project by right-clicking it and say, make it part of the project. Invariably, what would happen, though, is Visual Studio would crash when I did that. And the truth is, I don't really need them to actually be in the Solution Explorer. I just need them to be in my project layout folder area so that Visual Studio can find them. So don't try to bring these into your project. Just leave them hidden right where they are, knowing that they're there and you can take advantage of them. So now at this point, what we've done is we now have all the support necessary for us to begin to write our TypeScript files. So let's go ahead and start by writing our first TypeScript file, and we're just going to come in, right-click the app folder. Remember, app is where I want to create my TypeScript files. Bring up the new item, and now I'm just going to type in TypeScript like that so I can filter out and find it. And there's the TypeScript file I want, TS file. And this one we're going to call app.module. And I'm going to go ahead and click add. Now, my idea for this application is just to do something very simple, but I kind of want to show you the moving pieces that you will ultimately care about. And when I think about Angular 2 applications, particularly from an Office and SharePoint developer perspective, I think about a couple of different roles that my TypeScript modules will have. One of the most important is the creation of various services. When I think about creating services, I basically think about the data layer. It's an easy way to start, the data layer. So when we do Office and SharePoint development these days, we use REST, we use CSOM to talk to SharePoint lists, to talk to libraries, right? All the kind of functional interactions with SharePoint. So we'll do a lot of service creation. So I wanted to create a module in this example that sort of showed off a little bit of the data layer, but I want to keep it simple here. In a minute, I'll show you something more complicated, but let's go ahead and just grab the code here from the solution so we don't have to type it all in and we can just talk about it. And I'll grab this guy and drop it, and I'll just do a copy, and then I'll come back to my TS here and we'll do a paste. Okay, so what I've done here is I've created my first TypeScript file, and in here I've created a class called welcome. One of the great things about TypeScript is that you can write in a way that feels a lot more object-oriented than regular old JavaScript. And you can see here that I basically have a class with a single static method called getMessage that just returns simply a string. That's easy enough to understand. Because I've used the export keyword in my TypeScript, I'm basically indicating that this is also a module that I'm creating. And behind the scenes, because I've told TypeScript I care about using these as modules that are based on the system module loader, the fact that I've said this is exported means that it can be imported by the system module loader, but I don't have to worry about that. All of that stuff gets taken care of under the covers. And if I save it, then what happens is you save or compile this project, then it will build this. So we can do a build on this as well. And then those TypeScript files will get built as JavaScript files. And if everything is working the way we expect, I should be able to come in here and show the hidden files. And you'll notice that down here in the script section now, I have an app.module.js. So what happened is my TS got compiled into JavaScript, and it's now sitting there inside the scripts folder. Well, what I want to do is deploy this, right? So I can go ahead and right-click this and say, let's include it in the project. And that will make sure that it gets deployed. If I hide those files again, I can also come up here to the TS file, which I don't want to include in my project. And then I'll come in my deployment rather. And then I'm going to come down to the properties and see the deployment type where it says element file. I'm going to go ahead and change that to no deployment. So now what happens is my TypeScript files are staying here in the design environment with me. They're not going into SharePoint, but their output JavaScript files do go into SharePoint. And that's the critical thing we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so we have a simple TypeScript class that's just kicking out a string. We need to be able to consume that. So let's go ahead and add another TypeScript file. Type TypeScript again, add another TypeScript file. And this one we're going to call the app component. So we'll say app.component like that, and we'll go ahead and hit add. This one will be a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to go ahead and again cheat by grabbing the code from the solution so we can spend more time talking and less typing. Copy that out and paste it into our project. Okay, and now let's talk about what we've got here. Now, remember, I said that when I made my app module, right, that we use the export keyword, which made this module available to other modules. And then you'll notice in my app component, I'm using the import keyword, just the same way that you might set a reference to something in C# and as a using statement and import a library into C#. That now becomes the model for JavaScript. You can create libraries and import them into other libraries to make use of them. So what I'm doing is I'm importing the welcome class from app.module, which is the file that I just created. But you'll also notice that I'm importing the component from Angular 2 core. Now, this is where it gets interesting because those libraries that I downloaded using the Node Package Manager are now going to allow me to start writing Angular 2 using that, the Angular 2 framework. And this is where your JavaScript now becomes an Angular 2 application. Angular 2, there's a lot to learn there, and I'm certainly not going to teach it all to you in the time that we have here. But the basics that you want to know at this point are the component is really the foundation of what you make in Angular 2. And the component associates some level of functionality with some place where that functionality is going to render an output. So, for example, if you'll look at my component definition here, you'll see it has two pieces, the selector and the template. The selector is the location where the output of this component should be rendered. And this should look familiar to you because app-main is exactly what I put inside my placeholder main as the placeholder for all the output from my application. So what we're saying is that this component, when invoked, is going to put its output into the app-main selector. Now, what is its output? Well, that's determined by the template, which is simply an H1. And then inside of it, we call the getMessage method. Remember that static method that we created here, okay? That static method. And it's going to be an H1, and that H1 is going to appear inside the page. So it's as simple as that. Now, you can see, though, the model that I'm trying to show you, which is the component is the workhorse. It's the center of everything that's happening. But it can call to other components like or other services rather, like our app module, and ask it to do things like read a SharePoint list or get a document, upload a document, what have you. And obviously we're doing something simple here, but I want you to see that relationship between the component and the service behind it. I can go ahead and save that. And then now what we need is a way to start our application. So we have the moving parts, but we need a way to kickstart it. And you'll remember when I went to default.aspx back here, I showed you that we had configured our system module loader to look for something called boot as the very first module it loads. So there's this idea of bootstrapping your Angular 2 application. So you need a place for it all to start. This is just like anything you do in code. It's just like writing a console application that has a main start location, right? So we need a place where everything's going to start. So what we're going to do now is add a third TypeScript file here, and this one we're going to call boot. And go ahead and add that one. And then what I'm going to do is, once again, cheat and come back here and grab from the finished solution, the boot.ts, drop that in there, copy it, and come back to our application and paste. Okay. Now, what have we done here? Well, we're importing something called Bootstrap, which is the component that allows the application to bootstrap. So you can see we're getting that from Angular 2 platform browser. And then we're also importing our app component from app.component, which is right here, right? Here's our app component that we're exporting. So you can see the linkage now. The Bootstrap is linked to the app component. The app component is linked to the app module, the welcome service. And the first thing it's called is the Bootstrap, but then there's going to be a chain of events that ultimately results in that string being displayed to us. Now, I would also like to point out, one of the things that I think can be confusing when you're first working with Angular 2 is understanding this stuff, like Angular 2 platform browser. Basically, what's going on is that when you write TypeScript files, you're always going to import them using relative file locations like /app component, which basically says it's in the same folder as me and the file name is app.component. But when you get node packages through NPM, they use a slight modification of the export notation that TypeScript accepts, which sort of gives you, I think the simple way to understand it is it sort of gives you a way to name the path without actually knowing the path. So what we're saying is that when exported, it said, hey, if somebody's looking for me, they're going to be typing Angular 2 platform browser, and so you should wire me up when somebody's looking for that. And if you go down here a little bit in the project, you'll see that we have our project up here, our SharePoint app project, but then look what happened inside the Solution Explorer. Visual Studio added something called a TypeScript virtual project. What happened here in Visual Studio was it has identified all the different TypeScript files that are floating around the Solution Explorer, and it has brought them together inside of what it calls a virtual project. So if you open this up now, you'll see that it has a reference to our files. That's interesting. But it also has a reference to all the other things that we downloaded, like the TypeScript file that represents the core of Angular 2. So the reason I'm able to reference all of these different TypeScript elements from what we downloaded is because Visual Studio created this separate virtual project that sits beside my SharePoint add-in project and makes everything available. Okay, so now at this point, if we go ahead and build and look for the hidden files, hopefully what we'll see in the script section here is that everything is compiled. So there's our app component. We'll go ahead and add that to our project. Great. There's our boot right there. We'll add that to our project. Okay. And if you want debugging, you notice that you're also generating these map files, so you could include those as well if you wanted some debug capability. But let's just do the JavaScript ones for now, and then we'll close this back up again. And you can see that what we've managed to achieve now is that we have, we're back in the expected form for, hang on, I'm just going to close all the windows here. There we go. We're back in the expected form for a SharePoint-hosted add-in, which is we have our JavaScript files in the script section, which, remember, when we started was where the jQuery library is, but we got rid of that, and now we have our stuff in there. And if you take a look inside of here, it's kind of interesting to see the actual compiled JS. You can see my string, my hello world here, but do you see the system.register? Because I said that I wanted to use the system module loader. I told TypeScript I wanted to use the system module loader. So it takes care of formatting my JavaScript to be respectful of the system module loader so that my modules can be loaded dynamically as necessary. And I don't ever really even have to look at this JavaScript. Sometimes it's helpful, but the truth is I would really, really rather just deal with this. I mean, isn't this such a nicer way to write your code? I'm just writing classes, I'm just writing methods, I just have properties. Okay, well, if we've done everything right, we should be good to go. Let's go ahead and let's check a couple things. I always like to check to make sure we're not deploying. Yep, so let's go here and make sure we're not trying to deploy any TS files. So I'll change these deployment types to no deployment, right? So for that one's good. And this one needs to be changed. Okay, that looks good. I feel pretty good about that. I don't think I've forgotten anything. Let's hope it works. Big moment here. Let's go ahead and run and see if we're in business. Go ahead and start it. And at this point, you know, this should just be a regular SharePoint-hosted add-in that has some JavaScript in it. Really nothing special as far as SharePoint is concerned. So we're expecting a normal deployment. We're expecting the browser to start normally for us to log in to Office 365 and then to see the results of our work. So we'll give it a second to do that. We can see the installation in progress. Looking good. Get a browser start, great, as expected. We get an Office 365 login, as expected. And we'll go ahead and log into our tenant here. We get bounced to our SharePoint-hosted app, as expected. And hey, there it is. There's our first Angular 2 add-in with a big hello world message. I can't hear you, but I'm sure you're clapping at this moment as we pulled this off. And I'd like to believe that that will help you guys get your first application going. Now, before we wrap here, we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I got a little more time. So what I want to do now is let's do something a little bit more sophisticated. So it's nice that we got a hello world, right? That's always a good thing, makes you feel good about everything. But what we really want to do is do something where we're actually interacting with SharePoint. So I'm going to do a simple interaction with SharePoint, and we're going to switch from the hello world to welcoming the current user by name. Now, I've already created this SharePoint-hosted add-in, and I've already deployed it. So I'm just going to run it for you, and then we're going to take a little look at the code. So I'm going to come over here and just click on it. Here it is right here, the SharePoint-hosted add-in for Angular 2. Go ahead and click on that. Going to run my add-in, and then, not surprisingly, it says, welcome Scot Hillier. But the difference here is that I am dynamically figuring out who's running the application by using the client-side object model, and then I'm welcoming that person. So let's take a look at that code and see the differences between that code and what we finished with our simple project. Okay, here's the one we want right here. All right, so everything about this project is the same. I got here in exactly the same way as the steps that I walked you through. The only thing that's really different is that I have a service TypeScript object now. So I still have the component and I still have the boot, right? So here's the boot, nothing changed there. Here's the component that we just created. The only change here is that I'm calling a service instead of that simple object. But the real meat of it here is in the service itself. So let's take a look at what I've got here. This is pretty interesting stuff, and I think key for really getting the most out of your SharePoint add-ins with Angular 2. Basically, what I'm doing is using the client object model here to get the title of the current user. And you can see that here's the message, welcome, and then the current user's title. So that's how we got welcome Scot Hillier. Now, when I make this call, when I make this client-side object model call, we all know this is happening asynchronously. And in the past, we might have used promises to return a promise immediately to the caller and then fulfill that promise later when the value returns. In Angular 2, we're going to be using reactive extensions. And in particular, we're going to be using something known as an observable. So the easy way to think about observables is just think of observables as the new promise. So if you used to use promises, now you use observables. I had downloaded the reactive extensions using the Node Package Manager, and I'm able to import into my service the observable and observer. Those are the two things that I need. Now, when I create my get message, instead of just returning a string that is, hello world, I'm going to return an observable string. So this observable string is very similar to the concept of returning a promise directly to the caller. This is going to be fulfilled when the value is ultimately obtained through the client-side object model, and we're just saying that this value is going to be of type string. Now what I'm going to do is use the observable and the create method, observable.create. And you'll notice that observable.create creates an observable, and that's what I'm returning, right? So right away, you can see return observable.create. And inside of the create, you have a function, and that function receives the observer. So the observer is the representation of the client that you returned the observable to. So the observable can communicate back to the client by using the observer object. Next, I'll simply run the standard client-side object model code that you've seen a million times in a million demos to get the user's title. But in order to send it back, I'm going to use the observer object and call the next method, observer.next. Observer.next will take the value that you provide and it will send it to the client that received the observable result of the call. If you have an error, you can call observable.error and send that back. So now I have something that knows how to return an observable. Let's go to the component where this is consumed. In order to consume it, I'm also importing observable and observer here into my component, as well as the new welcome service from app.service. I still have my selector, which is app.main. Nothing's changed there. And I still have my template, which is an H1, which is going to display the message variable. Here's the message variable. But notice that this message variable is tagged as an asynchronous variable, Angular 2 knows what an observable is. And if you tell it that a certain variable is asynchronous, then it understands and will watch that variable. And when the variable changes, it will update the UI for you. So I've declared in my app component that I have a message of type observable string, which is exactly what is being returned from my service. Remember, I'm returning observable string. And then in the constructor for my class, I am going to get a service injected. Look up here where you have selector and template. Hopefully we're pretty clear about selector and template. I have a new piece in my component called providers. And providers says the list of services that will be injected into this component when this component is created. So I've said that during the construction of this component, I want a welcome service instance injected into this component. That injection occurs because I've provided a place in the constructor for that injection to happen. And Angular 2 takes care of the injection for me, but I'm going to be receiving an instance of that welcome service injected into my constructor. I can then simply call the get message method, which we know already returns an observable string, put that directly inside the message. That message will be displayed in the H1. Of course, immediately, we're not going to have the answer because it's an asynchronous call. But because we've declared it as asynchronous, when the value returns from the client-side object model, the UI will be updated. And we saw when I ran the application that that's exactly what happened. And then it says welcome, and it uses my name. Now, this is a relatively simple SharePoint add-in as well. But what's really neat about this example is it shows you all the moving parts. So it's easy, I think, to imagine now how you could take the ideas that I'm showing you right here, and you could do a full set of CRUD operations against a list. Everything you need to have to do that is really right here. Of course, there's some input forms and other aspects of Angular 2 that we're not showing, but really the heart of the matter is here. So it's a great place for you to get started. Okay, so that wraps up the items that I want to show you. Just a couple of things here again. There's an article that you can get to up on IT Unity on how to build the SharePoint add-in. Has a lot of the things that I just talked about. The source code is available to you on the IT Unity GitHub repo as well. If you don't know TypeScript, put that on your list of things to learn. There is a site, typescriptlang.org, that has all the information you'll need, as well as tutorials and instructions for you to go ahead and get started with TypeScript as well. There's certainly a lot to learn, but I have to say that I'm very excited about Angular 2. In fact, let's make sure we don't leave without showing you how to learn a little bit about Angular 2. So go to Angular.io. Okay, and if you go to Angular.io, this is where you can find all the documentation, starter stuff about Angular. So they have a nice 5-minute quick start up here that you can breeze through to learn a little bit about the components and the bootstrapping and that type of thing. There's an API preview up here that tells you all the different objects that you can use, and you can see some of the ones that I've been using as well. So there's good references for Angular 2 learning, for TypeScript learning, and then the article and code that I wrote to bring it all together. Okay, so that's it for me. We're going to go ahead and wrap here. I can take a quick look just to see if we have any questions floating around here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and looks like we've got a little Q&A here. The question I have here is, do you know if what I'm doing will work in 2013 Foundation? There's really nothing special about what I'm doing here with Visual Studio creating the SharePoint add-in. When you're done, you really just have a SharePoint add-in with JavaScript files, which is what I think is really cool about it. All of the TypeScript stuff that you're doing is all happening inside the Visual Studio environment. So that's the abstraction away. The output of it that you deliver is no different than it's always been. It's just some JavaScript stuff that you're going to push up into SharePoint. Okay, great. So I think that's it for us. We're right there at the top of the hour. I want to go ahead and be respectful of your time and let you guys get going. Thanks for spending the hour with me. Again, before we go, I want to make sure that I thank Microsoft for all their support. It was wonderful. I think we're in good shape here right at the top of the hour, and enjoy, and hope you guys got a lot out of it. Talk to you soon.